electrical engineering student here. And my name is Amrita Suresh, and we're seeing my master's in data science. Behind you is what we call the Rennick University Center. It's basically our main building on campus where we have our food source, we have our Starbucks cafe, we have a bookstore, so if you're trying to buy textbooks for classes or merchandise, that's where you go. We have our advising offices, organization offices, and all sorts of stuff like that in this building. All right, let's head out this way. Good. So we are right now at the College of Arts, Science and Letters. So this is one of the main buildings that undergraduate students have classes in. This building has departments for philosophy, anthropology, languages, English, math. We have a writing center, we have a piano room, we have music. We also have a department for mathematics and a math learning center. So if you have any questions about math or if you're stuck in any of your assignments, you can always stop by the math learning center and you'll have tutors available to help you out. And what are the other departments here? We have a TV studio, theater and film. So anything that comes under the umbrella of College of Arts, Sciences and Letters usually have classes and the departments housed in this building. So this building is 4 floors. I would have stopped a little earlier, but then because we have another group already over there, we just moved a little ahead. So if you actually look up, we have like 4 buildings. It's one of the larger buildings on campus. And fun fact, this is the only building that has a lot of vending machines. Like right around this curve is all vending machines. So we have like 6 to 8 vending machines available. So. Let's go. Battery synthesis and testing. The second floor has labs for computer science, along with gaming lab, mechanical engineering lab, and the robotics lab. And on the third floor, we have the cybersecurity lab, electrical computer engineering labs. So that's a quick gist about this building. There's some laboratories that have 3D printers, some study spaces that you can reserve just for you or with friends. You just have to reserve it for them. And all of our colleges have their own dedicated advising team as well. So this college has the advising team that's housed right behind us. It's called the CACS Advising Office. The same thing applies to the College of Arts, Science and Letters, College of Business, and College of Education, Health and Human Services. For either their courses or their organizations or projects. Above you we have these go-karts. These are designed by students and alumni on campus. And then the designs that you see, the Ford Shelby and then the dirt bike are also designs created by the engineering alumni here.
Good morning. Sabah khair. I think Assalamu alaikum is in order. Ask me to go off myself for a minute, so I think I'll do that. Let me first thank him also and all our colleagues at the university who made this possible. And you'll be happy, I hope, to know that there will be some food later on. Compliments the Arab American Studies Center. So I thank my colleagues there as well. Welcome to campus, maybe your future campus, who knows. Whatever your interest is, knowing oneself is very important. How then do we define ourselves? So there are ways to kind of arrive at self-ascription, as they call it. It's a useful word. I'm going to throw a few of those terms at you. Ascription is how you identify yourself. You ascribe as an Arab American, maybe if Islam is important in your life. You identify as a Muslim, maybe if you're a Christian. You're Christian first, maybe an Arab, maybe Lebanese or Palestinian, especially in situations like this, you know. So identity then is a very fluid concept. It follows the contours of your life. It is decided by your space and place, the immediate place you're at and the overall space in which you exist. And it also is influenced by the events in your life, in your personal life, maybe in your life as a whole. Some people identify as cancer survivors, for example, etc. So in due course, in a few minutes, I will ask you to answer that question. Who am I? I am what? How do you identify first? So you have a paper as part of the handout that says I am 1, 2, 3, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let me first of all talk about myself as I was asked to do. Without going on a soapbox, I am an immigrant, born in Jordan, although I never volunteered this to my students usually. Came to this country as a student and didn't think I had a place to go back to, so I stayed. My family joined, and I wanted to become a metallurgist. I loved metals. I grew up in a boarding school in Jordan, a German school. If you know anything about Germans, they're very industrious. I was really impressed. I had mentors all my life. I'm very, very grateful for that, which is very important too. So my mentor, there was a fire in our school in the iron workshop and all the metals melted. It was a very, very intense fire. And he actually could identify the metals by the spark they make when he applies the file. What do you call it? I'm sorry?
The fire.
No, it's a tool that spins really fast and...
Grinder?
Grinder, thank you. So he put the grinder to the metal, and from the shape of the spark, you could tell which metal it was. Vanadium, chromium, steel, soft iron, etc. I was really impressed. So I found my way to Flint, Michigan. Wasn't easy at all. To go to the General Motor Institute, the best institute in the world for engineering. I wanted to do Maschinenbau in German, or I think the equivalent of that is tool and die or something like that. But I couldn't get in. So I took all the technical classes. They told me you have to be sponsored by GM. You have to be a citizen. Good luck to you. So I switched to political science, but I was a very hard worker. And I had relatives in Flint. I knew very little who owned grocery stores. So I worked in one of their grocery stores, and I impressed them because I was such a hard worker. I have to tell you the story very, very quickly because it has to do with work ethic, and sometimes we identify through our work or our profession or our passion. So I worked in this grocery store. I know it's not very impressive, and raised by Germans, I have to give them credit. I went and cleaned up the back room. It was like empty bottles and chicken bones and half full beer bottles. It was not very fun. But I cleaned the place up. The owner came, went to the back room, and he was shocked. He said, "Oh my God, where did this sink come from?" It was a nice shiny sink, which I cleaned up, right? He had that business for almost 14 years and didn't even know he had a sink in the back room because of the dirt piled up on top of it. So I gained a reputation as being hard worker and ethical about my work. The word spread. This rich guy came to have a cup of coffee, and he approached me about the business, looking for someone to take it on because people kept going out of business in it. And I was doing a BA in political science with no idea about what it is I'll be doing next. So I took a look. Next thing, I owned it. But I knew enough to ask him for an option to buy the building. And my economic life was set for the rest of my life, not the profession itself. So Years went by, a couple of years went by, and I said to myself, who am I exactly? Did I come to the United States to own a business? I wanted to make a difference, wanted to do more considerable things. We have to contend with this, I guess. So, I wanted to know how come I own a business. So I started reading about this, and I found out that there is something called patron-client relationship. The patron, someone is established. The client is a newcomer, and they're sponsored, trained, put up by the patron, and then they own a business. And it turned out that I was the last link in a 100-year odyssey by people from Nazareth who came to Flint, Michigan, preceded by Lebanese families who opened businesses, and one brought the other, and that continued for 100 years. So I figured I'm going to go back and find out the first person who sparked this patron-client 100-year chain link. I found out it does exist in all communities. Greeks are big in restaurant business. Jewish people are started actually as peddlers. So did Arab Americans, as you will hear in a minute. And I went to the son of the man who came. You'll hear about him in a second. His name is Amin Farah. He owns all those papers, and he's the reason why I became a historian. He died in 1975, way before I came to the United States. Never knew him. His son told me, look, I have some papers in the basement. My father left. I don't know what to do with them. I don't read Arabic. Take a look. I took a look. I perused through them very quickly. I wasn't sure if they're worth anything. And he said, if you want them, take them. And those are the papers you see in front of you, some of the most important papers. Let me rephrase that. These are the most important papers in Arab American life. Yeah? And are they getting enough attention? We'll get to that when we talk about who we are and how we interact with events and history in our lives. Took them home. My mother was with me at the time. I lived with her, rather. And between the two of us, we were looking through the papers, and she lit up. She knew people from her childhood in Nazareth. And my mother was a refugee in Jordan. She was born a long time ago. And we didn't sleep until 6 o'clock in the morning. So I knew I had something. I enrolled in a doctorate program, in a master's program at U of M, to figure out why do Arabs own grocery stores and businesses. Entrepreneurship was a very huge part of their lives. At the time I finished my master's thesis, Arabic-speaking people owned 102 out of 104 grocery stores in Flint, Michigan alone. And that is repeated in every major metropolis across the country, from Chicago to New York to Los Angeles to San Francisco. Now they diversified. They're into real estate. All my colleagues are millionaires. In my case, I said, I'm going to enroll in a doctorate program to make sense of those papers. This is going to take the rest of my life. I was very stable. I tell people I used to pay more in taxes than they pay me now, but I wasn't very satisfied and happy. I could not identify as a business person confined to that space. And that's how I became a historian. And to understand immigrant experiences, I had to study about the theories, which we'll talk about very briefly. I'll go through the handout I gave you quickly. Don't be annoyed because we have a lot of information to kind of contend with. So, who are we? Depends very often on our environment. How we identify today may or may not change. But I'm really curious to know, as I speak, if you don't mind, if you have a pen, jot down how you identify yourself by number of priority. First and foremost is number one, second and third. So for a time, for example, when I got married, I would identify as a husband, I guess, as a father later on. Now the kids are out of my hair in college. I graduated from college. I don't know. I guess I have a little bit of back pain, which reminds me that I'm a cat dad because my cat keeps crowding me. I slept wrong, and my back is killing me. So some people identify as like cat mom and dog dad, and so the things that matter the most in our lives is define us. What are those things? What do you identify first, and second, and third, and below that? Please include, if you don't mind, you don't have to put your name, by the way. Just write down the name of a role model, any role model, from your personal life, from cultural life, it can be an artist, it can be a religious person, whatever you identify with. Preferably, if you're an Arab American, a role model from Arab American life. I'll be really curious to know that. So don't overthink it. However, whatever strikes your fancy, what do you identify first the most as, just jot that down. No worries. It'll be anonymous. Now, where do we start to talk about identity? There are theories that kind of rule that. If you go to the first page, assimilation models and scholarship, we try to avoid the term assimilation as much as we can, and the reason for that will become evident momentarily. But there were very important people who drafted or developed what is called immigration paradigms. You've heard Ustaz Wissam say that we are a nation of immigrants. How do people become American? How have they been integrated into their communities? How did they become citizens? It has a lot to do with how they identify as individuals. So the paradigms go something like, you come as an immigrant. In the case of Polish peasants, was one of the first studies. Lived in slums in Boston, Massachusetts, and a guy named Florian Znaniecki and I.W. Thomas, and a guy named Ernest Burgess came up with this cycle that first they face resistance, acceptance, integration. And every immigrant group that comes has to go through the same motions. They're resisted, they're treated with suspicion. You might have an idea, although you live in this bubble we call Dearborn, but when you basically leave that bubble and go in real life, you might find some resistance from people. If you're an Irish or Italian or Jewish descendant, you went through that process. The Polish were resisted, so were the Italians and everyone else. So until they were integrated. In fact, in the United States, Northwestern Europeans came here first. Those guys were English, Scots, Irish, not Irish, Scots, who identify closer to English than not. And then Finns, Danes, Scandinavians, from Finland, Denmark, Northwestern Europe, yeah? Some French, actually a lot of French people explored the Great Lake region before the Puritans came here, by 70 years, as a matter of fact. For the folks in Michigan history, whatever you write, a couple of pages would be great. By the way, I don't stress over this. A lot of information, whatever trickles or resonates with you, jot it down and you'll be good. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, is that the saying? I just want you to know that. So, and those guys became think of themselves as the original people who discovered this country. The trouble with that is that this country was inhabited by Native Americans, the original Michiganians, we call them in Michigan history, the First Nations, the Canadians call them. In fact, you guys heard of Plymouth Rock? Yeah? It's famous. You read about this for sure, right? It might surprise you to know that the guys who landed on Plymouth Rock in 1720, were greeted in English. Yeah. Because the French were here, abducted some of them, brought them back to England and France, and brought them back, and they learned English and French, by the way. So those guys discovered nothing. They explored the place, yes. But, and here is where identity becomes politicized, they began to mold the place in their image. Eventually, that became known as manifest destiny. So as they moved, they did not acclimate themselves or accommodate to their environment. They wanted to subjugate the environment in their image. Hence, manifest destiny. Like white, prototype humans, and everyone else is subhuman. So a lot of those immigrants who came, Irish, Poles, from Southern and Eastern Europe, when they began coming to the country in the mid-19th century, beginning with the Irish, and then Italians and Polish immigrants and Arab American immigrants, Arab immigrants from the Levant, from the Middle East, where Lebanon is. Take Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria combined, that's the Levant. The earliest Arabic-speaking people who came to this country came from the Levant, from that region. They spoke Arabic. We're reluctant to say Arabs because among them there were a lot of Armenians who spoke Armenian, identified as Armenian. Some were Kurdish. Some were Jews who thought of themselves as Arabs and spoke Arabic, but they were Jewish. This has nothing to do with political ideology called Zionism. We'll talk about that in a second also, inevitably. And those guys were resisted. So they were considered not quite white, not white enough. Yeah. As a matter of fact, the Polish people had to do jobs that African Americans wouldn't even touch in Boston and elsewhere. They lived in slums, eventually worked in factories, but to kind of navigate how those guys look white, so why can't they be considered white, right? So the Northwestern Europeans, the English especially, came up with this scheme called eugenics. It's a pseudoscience, yeah? And they said it's not enough to be white complected, like to have white skin, because there is like super race called the Alpines, descendants of the Teutons. You don't have to remember. If you get an idea about this, that's good enough. Don't be overwhelmed, please. But it's actually very funny. If it weren't too sad, it would be funny. So eugenics means that there is Alpine, and then the ones from like the middle of Europe are okay, but they don't really qualify. Southern Eastern Europe are called squareheads, not white enough. So eugenics is a pseudoscience that says genetically the Alpines, Northwestern Europeans, are white and they happen to be Protestant. Protestantism is an offshoot of Christianity. It's a Christian sect. And to be that qualifies you as for citizenship. So for a very long time, to be a citizen in this country, you have to be a free white man. Women were accepted, through their husbands and fathers and brothers, etc. Not full citizens. They could not vote. In fact, if one of your ancestors married a non-white person, they call it one drop of blood, the entire descendants of that marriage will not qualify as white. Such was the racism, that very, very hard line to keep the country as purely white as possible. So the first ones who suffered discrimination were the Irish, who came in large numbers in the mid-19th century. And so did the Poles and the Italians because they were Catholics. Arab Americans squeaked through. They looked white enough. Most of people in natural Syria look quite enough. So they worked very hard. Frankly, the citizenship battle was not a huge uphill battle. So, on your third page, or is it, yeah, on the fourth page, you see a word in bold letters called Anglo-Core. So a theory, one of the first immigration theories that arose is that the idea that those who arrive in this country will have to conform to model themselves, accommodate against an Anglo-Core, Northwestern European Anglo-Core, which is the model. You have to be as close to that as possible to be considered worthy of citizenship. That has another name. Have you heard the term the melting pot? It's not exactly a great term, by the way. Use it critically if you have to. Otherwise, avoid it. Because the melting pot means that you have to melt into something bigger, which means, by necessity, you would have to lose your own identity just to fit in. So, that model was challenged by an Arab American, which brings me to one of the first documents. I'm not going to do this throughout, we'll be here all day. But this is actually handwriting, which is very rare, by a fellow named Amin Rihani. Amin Rihani was a very famous poet, author, thinker, who, among other things, he translated the quatrains of Abu al-Ala al-Ma'arri. And he wrote the first modern poetry style, freestyle poetry in Arabic. He's the first to do that. And he wrote a small booklet called Letters to Uncle Sam. And he said that, hey, why am I downtrodden and barely accepted in this country? And I'm loyal to this country. In fact, I want to launch a Syrian American army to fight for Syria and then transplant American democratic precepts in Syria, my country. Syria, remember, always for the immigrants meant Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and even east of the Jordan River. That's very important to them. Hence, most of them identified. If you ask them, what are you? They would say, I'm an Arab, I'm Syrian, and then Orthodox or Maronite or Shi'i or Sunni or what have you later. That changes with time. But that's how they identified. So immigration paradigms kept progressing and people began to recognize those immigrants. So what Amin Rihani introduced, he's not given credit for this. The credit goes to a guy named Horace Callan, who was Jewish and a Zionist, for reasons I will not delve into for now, for our purposes. But Amin Rihani introduced a new concept called cultural pluralism, which simply means that you can be a member of the Arab nation, this Arab Syrian nation, and be American at the same time. Cultural pluralism. So instead of melting pot, we have cultural pluralist society, in his view, which looks like a mosaic. The mosaic as a whole will make up what the United States looks like. Okay? A country made up of many cultures who identify as American, yet are faithful to their roots, cultural roots. Yeah? Cultural pluralism. Only the country was not ready for this kind of thinking. So racism prevailed until after World War II, when the United States began to open onto the world. There's a really cool musical called South Pacific. If you have time, watch it. It's a musical. Most of the music is written by Oscar Hammerstein. And he talks about, this when Americans began to flirt with accepting, interracial marriage with Japanese and Southeast Asians. But the objective behind that was colonial. The United States was flexing its muscles and was modifying its views to accommodate other cultures. But nevertheless, there's a song inside that film, if you can watch it, look it up and watch it. a song about you've got to be taught. He married a local woman, and his family shunned him. They understood that, and they said as much. One of their important guests here, from two guests actually, one Syrian, one Iraqi. They both died in a car accident that same day, as a matter of fact, traveling from Flint to Detroit. Khalil Sheikh and Mufarraj were their names. Very important. They were collecting money for village revivification programs, Jam'iyyat In'ash al-Qura, across Syria and Iraq at the time. In any case, those guys, by that time, a lot of Arab Americans said, we are Arabs. We're proud of that. We want Palestine to be free. We want to reunify the Levant into Syria. But we are loyal Americans, and joined World War II, just like they joined World War I when they could, although many did not see enough action because the US did not want to fight in that war, entered very, very late. Started in 1914, the US entered in 1917, etc. But in World War I, Arab Americans per capita raised more money. They sold more war bonds than any other immigrant group. In World War II, they did the same thing. So I have a lot of pictures and documents that show that in Flint, Michigan alone, they sent at least 2 ambulances to the armed forces in the front in Europe. So now Arab immigrants who identified as Syrians increasingly began to identify as Arabs as a whole, but always as an American in addition, right? Now, something happened I didn't want to talk about in too much details. It's all over the news. Specific identities. I mentioned that the French carved out a piece of Syria and they called it Lebanon. That became the roots of what became Lebanese identity. Lebanese identity existed even before that. It came from the mountain areas surrounding the Beirut area, from the Lebanon. But it did not, it was subsumed within Syrian identity. And Syrian identity was subsumed in a larger Arab identity. Yeah? The weight, the center of gravity was actually in Egypt, where the country had the most complete cultural experience. In fact, a lot of the Syrians ran away from they were chased out by the Turks and ran to the safety of Cairo. That's where they established very, very important newspapers, like Al-Ahram, a newspaper. The official newspaper in Egypt was founded by the Sarkis family, Syrians. And there is many, many examples like that. They were influenced by and influenced the local scene, and many Palestinian and Syrian families became Egyptian to this day. Just like a lot of the families, you'll be surprised, like Sarainis, I can actually name a lot of families who you know as Lebanese families, large Lebanese families, are split between Nablus or Haifa or Jaffa or Nazareth, the Galilee, and Lebanon. When the Europeans drew those frontier borders, they split them in half. And hopefully they know that they are related. But a lot of it made no difference what part of the Arab world you're from, because the overarching marker of identity for Arabs, you are an Arab if you what? What is the most important thing that defines what an Arab is? Anyone?
Their language?
Absolutely. The Arabic language. It's a very powerful common denominator. It's like a window onto each other's souls. I can read Naguib Mahfouz and understand Egyptian history. And of course, this is interchangeable. So the language is actually is a vehicle for collective memory. Yes.
Why is there 2 or 3 countries that are Arab but they don't speak Arabic?
Say again.
Why is there 2 or 3 countries that they are Arab but don't speak Arabic?
You mean Djibouti and Mauritania and Somalia?
Yeah.
Well, those guys, those countries are members of the League of Arab States, but they identify as Djiboutis, Somalis, and Mauritanians. They have their own language. In fact, within the Arab world, within Algeria itself, you have the Berber or Amazighi, and they have their own language. Half of Iraq is, well, not half, actually. Northern Iraq, there's a lot of Kurds who were part of Iraq when Iraq was and Iraq is a member of the League of Arab States. So it's a fluid situation. In the case of Djibouti, I think it's for the benefits of belonging to a group. Then some Saudi money trickled into the country, and they find safety as part of the state of the League of Arab States, which is a voting bloc, hopefully acting in unison, but we know they're not unified as much as they should be, I guess. Would you agree? They're not. Are they? Are Arabs unified? Is there what do you guys think of Arab unity?
It's not that good.
They were constantly in war with each other.
Yeah. You can tell how much weapons and support they're sending to the Palestinians, right?
What, one, two?
I'm being facetious, you know that, right?
Fireworks, they said.
Say again?
They're saying fireworks only.
Fireworks. Yeah, hopefully food. But yeah, we can talk about the present. But it's good to look at the past on its own terms, not through the prism of the present. Because if you understand history, the reason why I think history is important, I honestly had no inkling I'm going to become a historian until I became one. But understanding the past helps you understand your present, and then it helps you chart the future, right? So far we have the Arab National League. Arab American Identity was born. And then Arab Americans suspended its operations and joined World War II, like good Americans, which they also were, yeah? They fought in World War II. During World War II, in 1944, they established what is called the Institute of Arab American Affairs. That organization is even more sophisticated than all the ones that preceded it because they used mostly English in their correspondence. They began to understand fully the value of lobbying and influencing public opinion. They began, as did the Arab League, but those guys did it in a more intensive way. They began to issue study papers about the Middle East. Introducing Arabs to Americans was the name of one of the booklets they issued, and Palestine became a core issue for them. Not because Palestine is special, but it is because that's where the need was the greatest. Remember when the British and the French divided everything between them? What I neglected to mention to you is that the British issued a promise called the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that promised to allow Jewish communities from Europe to have a home, a national home for themselves in Palestine. If you want to understand the spark behind the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's not a Muslim-Jewish thing, it's not an Arab thing, Arab-Jewish thing, it's not ancient, none of that is true. It started with that promise because it motivated many Jews to come from Europe. This is way before the Holocaust was, way before even Nazism was an idea. Supported by the British and the French to a measure, displacing Palestinian communities. That's where the problem began. So, Palestinians specifically began to identify themselves as Palestinians, beyond Syrians, Arabs, of course, but as Palestinians in response to the rise of Zionism. Zionism is a political ideology. I'll give you two definitions for Zionism. There's spiritual Zionism. Albert Einstein was one of those, and he was very good friends with the founder of the Arab National League. His name is Fuad Shatara. And Albert Einstein believed that, okay, Palestine is a spiritual place where Jews yearn to because they have, religious connections. And they always have, and they always live there in small numbers, as it were, but they can go visit from Northern Africa, from Eastern Europe, and always felt welcomed, or they were not molested or hampered or stopped or bothered. I mentioned that Islam gives sanction to people who believe in God, and Islam meant that. So Christians not only survived but thrived. In fact, if you go back 800-900 years, 1,000 years, there were houses established by the Umayyads and the Abbasid dynasties, these are the early Islamic dynasties, to translate the Greek classics into Arabic. Those translations are the only reason we know anything about the Iliads or Aristotle or Socrates. You know those names, right? Because from Arabic, they were translated into Latin and other languages. See the connections? We're talking about cultures in contact. But political Zionism is a different animal. It's not spiritual. It's not about spirituality. It's about establishing a state with a perpetual Jewish majority. We call that apartheid, or a racist system. So, I'll end with the Institute of Arab American Affairs, which lasted until 1951. In the interim, Arab Americans always lagged behind Jewish Americans in terms of numbers. And after the news of the Holocaust began to spread, more and more Jews, millions of Jews, joined this idea of Zionism, and Arab Americans basically stood their grounds and defended their culture and their vision for their future overseas, namely a free Middle East, a free Palestine, but that became a political conflict that got worse and worse. So in 1948, Israel was established in Palestine, in all of Palestine except the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In 1967, the Jewish forces, which outnumbered by far all those Arab armies by about fourfold, took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Golan Heights from Syria, Sinai from Egypt. Until there was a peace agreement, they gave Sinai back. They never gave back the Golan Heights, and the conflict continued. And Gaza became besieged place with the most densely populated area in the world, and you know what happened. And if you don't, you should read on that. I recommend you look up on, you guys like YouTube? TikTok? Look up Norman Finkelstein. He's going to be on campus next year, hopefully. I'm pretty sure. Inshallah, as we say, God willing. So Norman Finkelstein talks about Gaza in details, what happened there. So does a former colleague, a friend, her name is Sarah Roy. She wrote a huge book called The Gaza Strip, and others did. But it's good to be educated, and frankly, social media is becoming more reliable than CNN or the networks or the cable news. But you have to be judicious and avoid propaganda. So the more information you have from books and historical resources, the more you'll be able to distinguish between fact and fiction when it comes to social media. But that's another big topic. But you know, all the information you have about what's happening in Gaza is thanks to the social media. So
Can we take questions?
absolutely. So this wraps it up. There's 50 years beyond that of Arab American life, but let's let you kind of decide what comes to mind. If you have any questions, I know this is a long spiel, but what do you guys think? We're talking about identity here. I'm really curious to know what you wrote.
Yeah. So what we can do is, because we have about 11 minutes before we serve lunch, and then about 1:30 we'll be leaving here for the little hike. So thank you very much, Dr. Bawardi, for the presentation. We're gonna have Dr. Bawardi, if you can just be present with the students. You can go after we serve lunch. You can go around looking at the different posters, and Dr. Bawardi is going to be here if you have any questions. about what you're seeing or reading or about the speech. If you also want to take a look at some of these documents, these ones, please don't touch them, but you can take a look at them. And before we go to lunch, break for lunch, I wanted to also introduce Dr. Wissam Al-Maligi, who is the director of the Center for Arab American Studies. If you want to say a word, Dr. Wissam, about integrating identity from an artistic perspective, I'd like to get your input on that just for a few minutes. And also thank you for collaborating with Dr. Bawardi on putting this together.
Oh, wow. I've already staying here for a long time.
Thank you so much.
It's a feast, huh?
It is a feast.
Okay. Thank you so much, Wissam, and welcome to all of you over here. And I'm very happy to be with Professor Bawardi, who is, as you probably know, I mean, like in just a brief time, he's given you a well of knowledge, and you can imagine what it would be like to have him as a colleague. I'm very fortunate to have that, and those of you who might join, I mean, and maybe take, you're fortunate enough to take one of his classes, you will learn so much. I've already learned so much just by looking at these and listening to what he was saying. So thank you to Bawardi for this. It's an honor to work with you. And thanks, Wissam, of course, for inviting us and for bringing the students here. And thank you for coming. I'll just speak very briefly. My name is Wissam Al-Maligi. I'm originally from Egypt, so I was very happy when Dr. Bawardi mentioned Egypt a few times. I mean, I always feel that. I'm the director of the Center for just, a couple of years, the Center for Arab American Studies. What I also want to mention over here is another aspect which is related to Arabic. And again, you heard Dr. Bawardi talk about Arabic language as one of the common features that bring Arab speakers and Arab Americans together. I'm also director of the Arabic Arabic Studies major, and it's an important aspect to keep in mind when you consider studies. So what I will talk about very briefly is this aspect of the Arab part of the Arab American identity, or the Arab part of this, what we sometimes refer to as a hyphenated identity. My main focus is on literature aspect, actually. So how far is identity formed by culture? How far is identity formed by literature, by the cinema, by music, in addition to other things such as religion, for instance? But how much of Arab American is Arab, basically, and how much of it is American? That's an important aspect to keep in mind when you explore your own identities, your own backgrounds, and whether you're looking at very Arab American TV shows like Rami, for instance, for those of you who have watched sort of parts of that, or like looking at presentations, and Bawardi teaches a course on that as well, and there are many about how Arabs are demonized in cinema and in Hollywood, and have been for a very long time. But how much does the Arabic-speaking world know about Arab America? And that's a point I would like to discuss sort of very briefly, or like at least like throw a few points over there. Translation becomes a very important issue. In this sense, again, Naguib Mahfouz was mentioned in the previous talk, and someone like Naguib Mahfouz would not have been known to many Arab Americans, particularly of a younger generation, if he had not been translated, because of also aspects of the language. But if it wasn't for translation movements, in the case of people like Mahfouz, his entire work was translated by the American University in Cairo, and there have been, of course, translations as early as, much earlier than that, going all the way back to Baghdad, going all the way back to the House of Wisdom in medieval times, in the Abbasid times, which have essentially contributed to what is referred to as the Renaissance in Europe, which would not have been possible without translations from Greek to Arabic and from Arabic to the different languages of Europe at the time. So when we talk about integrated identities, and you have that a lot in the United States, like with the hyphenated identities you see in African American, Asian American, Arab American, and so on. There's an aspect of it, which is the first part of that keeping it in itself isn't an element of pride, isn't an element of going back to your roots. Is it just a cultural hegemony thing where you sort of bring two cultures and mesh them up together? What I would encourage everyone to look at is look at translations and also look at original sources, where particularly when I can try to compare cultures, talk to your parents, if they are from Arabic heritage, and find out the differences between what they have learned if they are first generation or immigrants, for instance, and what they have studied and what they have understood. Because a lot of the things that we discuss and that we study here, a native speaker of Arabic from Egypt or Lebanon or Palestine or Syria might have studied those even in high school, might have actually read about those as at your age in Arabic, which completely redefines or shapes the experience that is filtered down to you in a different way. I won't take a lot of time, but one of the things I would strongly advocate for, in addition to sort of the Arab American aspect, is also the Arab aspect of the Arab American aspect. And that would that require learning the language? So be it. I mean, because we have one thing in linguistics called diglossia, and diglossia in linguistics, to define it very briefly, is when one language has many different dialects that are very close to it, but that also seem to acquire a life of their own. And Arabic is one of the most powerful languages spoken ever, and it's one also of the most versatile. It's one of the most flexible, and that's why you have Fusha, or Modern Standard Arabic, and you also have so many dialects. We were already talking about people who do not speak Arabic necessarily, but who live in Arabic-speaking countries, and they learn Arabic. I mean, at a certain point, Arabic was an elitist kind of language, even, or a language that you needed to learn if you were Persian, or if you're Greek and you want to get high office in Baghdad or in Cairo in the 10th century or in the 9th century, you would learn Arabic. The idea here, how much of Arabic is a unifying element and how much of it is a divisive element. I would say that the fact that Arabic can grow and develop into dialects is not actually divisive. It's the other way around. It is something that can bring people together even more, as long as we stick to a knowledge of the original as well, or of the classical. Because even classical Arabic, what we consider as Fusha, and a lot of people complain, it's difficult, and the grammar, I mean, with all respect to American schools, I mean, grammar apparently is not something that a lot of people have heard of, even in English. I've struggled that with my own children when we came here from Egypt, because they knew about even English grammar more than many people teaching them. But the thing here is, even standard Arabic has developed from classical Arabic, which was used in poetry in pre-Islamic times and in the Quran. And then that developed in what we consider modern standard Arabic. And when Professor Bawardi talks about Al-Ahram, newspapers as important as that introduced what some people refer to as white Fusha, which is a language that is still standard Arabic, but it is not as complicated or as complex as classical Arabic. It can be read by everyone. And this was a revolution, because people like Naguib Mahfouz, like Taha Hussein, like many of the major men of letters or writers or people of letters or writers in the 20th century were using that language, or were using that version of Arabic language. So this is an ability, or this is a very powerful tool that we have as Arabs or Arab Americans, that is probably one of the few things that we still have going for us. The ability to understand each other and to be united through documents that we can read in a language that very few people would understand and would see the sinewy sort of differences in them. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Professor Bawardi, again. Thank you, Sam.
All right, we'll start with the middle school with Dr. Takush. They're going to have their lunch first because the high school already had lunch. The high schoolers, please approach to look at the documents and signs, and then we're going to call you next to pick up your sandwiches. And Professor Bawardi is here. Dr. Wissam is here. If you're interested in coming to University of Michigan, Dearborn, you're thinking of some electives or maybe doing a minor or even doing a major in any of...
My name is Wissam al-Maliki, and I'm the director of the Center for Arab American Studies, and I'm also director of the Arabic Studies and Comparative Literature programs.
It's nice to meet you. What do you think in regards to identities and like integrating identities? What's your opinion? Like, how do you explain it into more of like a shorter summary?
The whole idea of integrated identities, that's a big sort of issue, but in the United States, because we have what they sometimes refer to as hyphenated identities, like Arab American, Asian American, African American, is an attempt to acknowledge
heritage speakers or people of heritage of different origins, and it's a way to honor and pay homage to immigrants that form this country. At the same time, aspects of it can be problematic in the sense that is there a push for integration, like asking people to integrate without acknowledging where they come from? Or is it the hyphenation, does that make it enough? For us as Arab Americans, part of our heritage is actually already very rich, even before becoming part of an American identity. And the language plays a very important part for the Arab American aspect, and a lot of people already speak the Arabic language, whether it's first or second generation, and even through that, the Arabic language itself is divided into dialects in addition to the standard Arabic. So I would say the integrated identities is a way that can be looked at positively to enrich our identities, our cultures, as long as we are aware of the fact that it should not overshadow the heritage of where we come from.
That's perfect. Thank you for that. In regards to this training, how do you think it's important, or why do you think it's important?
Regarding
the training for students.
I think students are the future of any country, and I think being trained in order to understand where you come from, what you are capable of doing. I think Arab Americans in particular, and students in general, are capable of much more than they think they are. And because institutions, whether academic or financial, are not run by very young people, they tend to ignore the needs of younger people, and they tend to shape the futures of younger people from their own perspective. And what training can help is that it can motivate younger people to shape their own future, because actually they're shaping everybody's future in a while. So they should start early. And I think this is where caring for younger people has to do with also preparing them for a future where they would be not just on their own, but they would actually be leading everyone else. And I think this is where training comes in. We're preparing leaders, and not just independent or individuals, but also leaders of an entire nation and leaders of the world, actually.
Thank you so much for that. Do you think they'll get anything out of this kind of training?
I think students, some people, definitely younger, but even older people might view integrated identities as something that can be taken for granted. I mean, you are in a place, so geographically you belong to that place.
Yeah.
A training in integrated identities is important because it can put an extension to where you are. So you are not where you are. You are also what you and your families have been. That's in the past and in another land, and what you can become, and that is in the future as well, which might also be in another land. So integrated identities and the training in it would expand the perspective of young minds, and of actually adults and grown-ups as well, and older people, to understand that you are not only limited to the space of where you are or to the time where you are much more than this. You are what happened before you and what can happen after you, and you have a lot of agency and a lot of power to control that and to shape it as well.
Thank you so much for joining us for this interview. It's nice to get other people's opinions on this kind of topic, because in regards to worldly situations, I feel like people could respond more, like, I guess, get a different viewpoint in regards to Arab American history.
Yes, I think we as Arab Americans have a duty towards ourselves and to our culture to let people know who we are and where we come from. And I think our students have a lot going for them, and they are much more powerful than they think they are. And they are capable of a lot more. I mean, you're way more powerful than you think you are. And I'm very happy that you're joining us here at the university, and welcome.
I'm Hani Bawardi. Talked about myself during the spiel because Ustaz Bassam suggested I do. So what else would you like to know?
In regards to integration with identities, could you give us a brief, short summary in regards?
Sure. There is something called immigration paradigms, which kind of delineates how immigrants become Americans. they're not accepted automatically as Americans. And everyone went through that motion. So for Europeans, it's a process of quote unquote becoming white, like how the Irish became white is a title of a book. So Arab Americans kind of follow the contours of this journey of integration. The more salient word is assimilation, which is not critical enough in my view. We also use the term the melting pot. Melt into what, right? So the idea was that we melt in, we accommodate an Anglo core because Northwestern Europe became, in those people's minds, because they were a majority, a powerful one, white, Catholic, to the exclusion of others. Protestant, I'm sorry, not Catholic at all. Protestant and white to the exclusion of others, even including Southern Eastern Europeans who were not considered white when they first came. The Irish, beginning with the Irish, mid-19th century, and Polish, Italians. Arabs have also had to fight for inclusion as citizens. So they had to prove that they are white because you have to be a free white person to qualify for citizenship. And frankly, because they looked white enough and they were hardworking, local judges kind of took their side, and it was not a huge battle per se. But inclusion becomes harder when you have more diversity. Like you had immigration restrictions in this country from 1924, between 21 and 24, it's called the quota system, all the way until 1965. So only a small percentage, 1% of the people from any country already in the United States can enter. And that kind of severed immigration, and Arab Americans became cut in two waves. The original immigrants who came late 19th century, early 20th century, until World War I, and those.
I also had a question about how is the training important?
How is
the training important for
training?
For the students?
Training in, what do you mean by training?
As in the whole speech in regards to like the conference, in regards to like how do you think Arab American history is important to the future of other students?
Well, if you receive an email from me, at the bottom it says, "There is no substitute for a people telling their own story." And the quote I borrowed years ago from an author, a thinker named Rashid Khalidi. And I think the more people understand their own history, the more they control their own destiny and the narrative. You don't have to control the narrative, but you have to contribute to forging it. In the process, you become aware of who you are as a person and as part of a community. So collective memory is important. How well we relate to each other as members of a community basically is a main ingredient for what the community is and how likely it is to achieve its potential. So Arab American Studies, unfortunately, is lagging behind other ethnic studies. For example, Polish Americans, Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, Irish Americans wrote themselves into U.S. history. I cannot say that we have done that. In my case, I had a lot of mentors, beginning with Professor John Bukowczyk, who is Polish, and Barbara Aswad, and Janice Terry, and Michael Suleiman, Edward Said, and it's a long list. When I ask people just younger than myself, in their 40s, pushing their 50s, who are your mentors, they cannot come up with an answer, which frankly scares me. So we kind of abandoned the essential studies about Arab Americans and writings in Arabic. We neglected translations. We didn't have repositories that are cared for and made available to scholars. That's why I felt that the safest place for all these documents is in my possession right now. So I'm still shopping for a place to deposit them. We'll see about that, but they are available to scholars to look at. The problem is very, very few people in Arab American studies, Arab American experts in the entire country. I am one of two people who are native speakers. More young people are attracted to Arab American studies lately and to history, fortunately. But we have not translated essential writings by the early immigrants, including the output of the Arabat al-Qalamiyya, or the pen bond. I'll give you an example. There's a book written by Abdul Masih Haddad, who is a member of that society, the pen bond, along with Gibran Khalil Gibran and others. And he wrote a book called Hikayat al-Mahjar, Tales of the Diaspora. And that book describes the day-to-day lives of early immigrants in Lower West Side of Manhattan. I cannot say that in the English language we have a word about what life was like in Lower West Side of Manhattan in details, the details of that life. Yeah, we talk about it in general terms. But those guys were very, very productive, and they understood their place in history and who they were, and wrote about that. So we need to translate their works in order to understand where we came from.
Thank you so much for your time, and this was an amazing meeting. I'm sure the students would have definitely learned from this.